Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares, and I've got a little bit of a different time lapse today. Well, the only thing that's really different about it is that I'm attempting a new kind of style. I wanted to try making some sort of perspective piece, and the whole thing's going to be inspired by that sort of typical like anime-esque shot of a pilot at the controls of a ship or a mech or something. To set this up, I began by constructing some perspective lines that define the area inside the cockpit. And I didn't realize this until reviewing the footage here, but the construction here is a little bit flawed because my perspective lines, like if they were to continue to keep going, they don't actually ever meet up. So this isn't exactly a one-point perspective like I was hoping to achieve, but I'm reasonably happy with how the final product turned out, so there was hopefully something about this that was a little bit forgiving by the time I finished it. That was at least the benefit of attempting this, and recording the time lapse. I was able to review it and kind of catch that mistake, so if I were to attempt this in the future, I'd at least know to look out for that next time. And that was kind of the point, though, that I was looking to do something really different that would be a challenge, and I wanted to see if I could apply, whatever kind of knowledge or style tendencies that I have in a new direction. This is sort of a tactic I use sometimes when I don't know what to make at all. I'll think about some area that I can improve on and just focus on the challenge of that task more than the specific subject matter of the artwork itself. So prior to this, I studied up on a few techniques for conveying foreshortening, which is where objects that are closer to the viewer have that sort of exaggerated perspective. It's obviously used a lot in comics and animation to give a really dynamic look, and one of the approaches for this kind of construction that really clicked with me was just to build everything out of simple forms, like using cylinders and rectangles, but then trying to imagine their appearance kind of skewing according to those perspective lines. Here you'll see I've tried to replicate that idea with the added challenge of trying to maintain clean lines and angles in a pixelated style. I tried to find those pixel-perfect angles that would keep everything looking sharp, but still work within the perspective that I laid down. So there are two slopes here for the arm, using 1 and 2 pixel segments to create that appearance and those angles. Once that construction was in place to guide me, I fill in those lines to create solid shapes that form the arms and the hands. So even though it starts out pretty crude, I find it easiest to use simple shapes like this just as a bit of a guide, such as using the large circles for the hands. And then throughout the course of refining it, you can keep carving away and adding details to shape it into what you need. As I continue on here, often I would copy paste over one arm to the other, just to keep updating that opposite side and to have some idea how the rendering was coming along. Another thing that really helps is using layers to your advantage for building up a little environment like this. For example, even though we'll never see the pilot's seat in its entirety, I find it easier just to be able to hide the layer of the pilot and then work on the seat by itself, how it might look on its own, and then bring back in those layers to see how everything fits together, rather than trying to create the depth of this artwork on one layer entirely. It's also a bit of a safety net, so you're able to backtrack and just edit the pieces separately if you end up taking a new direction throughout the course of making it. Alright, as far as technical specifications go on this one, I'm using an overall canvas size of 180 by 180, and then the actual artwork area inside that is 100 by 100. When drawing in a small canvas like this, I like the way that it looks when it's sitting in a larger area like that. That way it automatically creates a little bit of distance when you're viewing the final product, which I think helps for this small scale stuff. And also it gives the option for some added room if you want to add decorative borders or text and other stuff like that. The actual decision to use 100 by 100 as the artwork area was a bit arbitrary, but since it's a small area, the result I know will end up looking obviously really pixely in that space. But also I've done pixel art portraits before that have been around 30 pixels or so in height, so I knew that the pilot's head in this art could take up kind of a similar amount of room on the canvas here, and it'd be a sizing that I know I'm already comfortable with. Another thing that helps with style consistency here is that I never really fully render out any single part of the image before moving on to another. What I mean by that is I'll work on a certain area for a little bit, like the hand or the arm, and then once I made a little bit of progress, I'll move on to another area and do kind of an equivalent level of rendering over there for a while. This way I think whatever style or logic you're applying to the rendering can be applied consistently across the piece, and overall it gets built up at a somewhat even rate. This is sort of the same way I approach character sprites or full scenes, so even though I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone here trying to work on a brand new type of image like this, I've at least got that process in place to kind of keep everything on track. So actually, this isn't quite the first time I've done something in perspective like this. There was a piece that I did before. It was a pixel art recreation of that iconic explosion frame from Akira, and it required kind of breaking down the perspective from that original art and then translating it into a pixel art construction. But that one felt a bit different because it was created from this beautiful piece of reference art, so that was there to hold my hand along the way, I suppose. Still a fun exercise though. I think style came together fairly well for this one, considering. although I was unsure at times what direction to take it in. Like, you may have seen at one point I was deciding if the whole thing should have a strong use of outlines or not, but with having to conform to the perspective style grid, I felt like having more lines, if there were outlines, might just be too distracting or like tricky to work out in a clean way. So I opted instead to just work with the grayscale values and then add whatever kind of amount of shading or lighting I could to help convey these objects. I'm using a total of 6 grayscale tones for this, which are evenly spaced between brightness values of 15 up to 90. And my approach was just to treat it like a sort of value painting. So I'd start with some solid color and then continue to add shading and highlights until I reached a nice level of rendering that also conveyed the form or texture of these various objects. With this approach, you can kind of also control the distribution of light and dark tones to create some interesting focal points through the use of contrast. In my case, I've used a wider range of contrast and detail on the pilot so that he can hopefully become the focal point of the environment. I mean, the composition and the perspective definitely help that as well. And then I saved a lot of the lighter colors to use for some of the various button and screen effects that would have like bright glowing lights and that kind of thing. The final bit of construction was adding in a bunch of these little environmental details, like screens and little gadgets within the cockpit. And I tried to work out the way that those perspective lines kind of fan out in various directions so I could create these objects along those exact angles. It's really important for this kind of drawing that each object be oriented properly like that, so that the perspective on each and every little detail kind of adds up and reinforces that same overall structure, kind of all leading inwards along those grid lines. As I mentioned earlier, I was a little bit more focused on the task of this one as opposed to the style of the design itself, so a lot of the character and environment here was more or less improvised. By default, it took a very sci-fi theme for me, of course, and I tried to incorporate like different types of screens and lights, kind of keeping everything within a pretty simple and clean design to it. I think I'll have to revisit this concept at some point though, or maybe like do a series of these type of illustrations, trying out different themes for pilots and ships and stuff like that. I think it'd be fun to do ones that are more like villain type ships, or maybe even try something that's just like a little bit scrappy looking in general. One of my favorite things about this though became that it kind of reminded me of some sort of like dialogue or cutscene kind of thing from a game, so I eventually set it up to do a small animation with that idea in mind. I created 2 different color versions, one of them with just a dark like blue to purple cast using the gradient map overlay, and this would be like the default look for inside the cockpit. Then I created a second gradient map set to a very saturated red color, and I could toggle this on and off and use it for sort of like an alarm going off inside the cockpit, just to create some drama, I guess. In order to give a bit of movement to the character, I went in and had to sort of cut and paste a few different parts of the image on their own layers, and that way I could control them separately. See, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about trying to maintain layer separation for different components of the image. I guess at some point I had merged things together, so I just required that I go back and kind of separate it out before setting up the animated movement. The last piece though is of course the dialogue, and I don't know about you, but I absolutely adore when games have like a really loose English translation, which leads to really classic lines such as,
"All your base are belong to us. Somebody set up us the bum. The winner is you."
There's just something so fun and wholesome about having these statements be not quite right. And I wanted to replicate that feel for my image, and so this might be one of the most bizarre things I've ever done to complete a piece of artwork, but I came up with a line for our hero to be exclaiming, which is, "The enemy, their fire is precise and their movements are swift," which is already a goofy line, of course, but then for like an added touch of authenticity, I popped it into Google Translate and ran it back and forth a few times to garble it a bit. So I'll save that final translation for the reveal, which coincidentally we'll go into now. Oh, and I ended up calling this guy Jace, so let's take a look at the final artwork of Jace from his hit new series, Captain Jace, or Jace Man, the Super Spaceman. Yeah, I don't know, something like that. Anyway, here we go.
Enemy, your cannons are good, you're fast.
Alright, I hope you enjoyed seeing me figure my way through this artwork. I had fun with the presentation on this one, so let's move along and finish it off in a more authentic way with some CRT time. Thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.
Enemy, your cannons are good, you're fast.